Good evening. The title of my talk tonight is How to Breathe and Feel with Plants, and part one is titled Breathing. Since the age of 3, I have been suffering from severe and debilitating seasonal allergies. When one sunny day in May, I experienced sudden facial swelling and was no longer able to breathe in the midst of a protracted asthma attack, my mother rushed me to a hospital where the doctors diagnosed an acute allergic reaction. Every subsequent spring, I have relived on a smaller scale the initial shock of those days that are etched amongst my earliest memories. Just when the revival of spring happens, and the plant world begins to bristle with its radiant colors, I find myself cut off from the outside, barely able to see, smell, taste, or breathe. A watery barrier arises between my sense organs and their corresponding objects, disrupting the transparent workings of intentionality. Our physical and spiritual alienation from plants is, in the end, one and the same as our alienation from the rest of the organic and inorganic universe. And my suggestion here is that these physical allergies are reflections and consequences, more or less direct, of what I would like to call a metaphysical allergy of Western philosophy to the plant world and to the environment as a whole. I will say more about this in just a moment. The rejuvenation of vegetation coincides with my autistic confinement within myself, complicated by an adverse reaction to the antihistaminic medicine which is supposed to alleviate this condition. But I was not alone in my predicament, as most of my classmates developed seasonal allergies as well. There was no secret as to the reason behind the veritable epidemic of pollen allergies. A large air-polluting factory was situated just a few hundred meters from my neighborhood. In its infinite wisdom, the planning committee of the city of Moscow, where I lived, decided to construct this particular factory very close to the woods so as to counterbalance the adverse effect of pollution with the air purified by plants. As a result, depending on the direction of the wind, we sensed either the smell of toxic fumes that emanated from the industrial monstrosity in our backyards, or fresh air that drifted from the woods. Tree pollen and grass allergies, triggered by factory and traffic pollution, are symptomatic of everything that goes wrong with the human relation to plants. Often described as the lungs of the planet, the woods that cover the earth offer us the gift of breathable air by releasing oxygen in the process of photosynthesis. But their capacity to renew the air polluted by human industry has long reached its limit. If we lack the air necessary for a healthy life, or indeed for any kind of life, it is because we have both filled it with chemicals and undercut the plant's own tendency toward regeneration of their growth and of the atmosphere which they enrich. Nevertheless, the warning that rapid deforestation combined with a massive burning of fossil fuels, which are largely the remnants of past plants, is an explosive recipe for an irreversible ecological disaster, this warning falls on deaf ears. In harming the environment, and in general the vegetal world, we are harming ourselves, as though cutting off the oxygen supply that keeps us alive. However, when the body attempts to defend itself from the undeniably dangerous toxins, it overreacts, shuts itself off from the outside, and rejects the nourishing and invigorating elements of the surrounding world as well. It thus misrecognizes benign plant pollen rather than industrial waste that pollutes our air, waterways, and all the other elements as the source of a threat. At the same time, allergies show that our extreme separation from exteriority, including that of plants, is untenable. After all, with every breath we take, we expose our lungs to the outside world, regardless of all the barriers we have erected between the environment and ourselves. Becoming completely isolated from the ecosystems we're a part of amounts to signing our own death sentence, given that without plants, we cannot continue to breathe, live, or be. In light of the allergies that have been inflicted on my body, I was determined not to let my thinking be affected by what I saw as the widespread conceptual allergy to plant life in Western philosophy. That is undeniably one of the roots of my books on vegetal philosophy thus far. The more I worked on these writings, the clearer I saw the connection between the philosophical dogma that plants were the least advanced of living beings, a cultural rejection of any sort of ethical responsibility toward them, and their economic transformation into raw materials for production or combustible biofuels. I realized that my physical allergies were caused, more or less directly, as I mentioned a moment ago, by the prevalent intellectual or metaphysical allergy to the complexities of plant life. What then could be the way to recover our physical and spiritual breath together with that of the plants themselves? On the face of it, everything in vegetal breathing is opposed to ours. Plants reprocess carbon dioxide into oxygen, while we breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide. They breathe at the surface through the leaves that are exposed to the outside, while we inhale by filling the interiority of the lungs with air. And yet, not all human breathing is accomplished by the lungs, seeing that our whole bodies breathe through the pores in our skin, the largest organ in the body. We tend to pass over this more vegetal mode of respiration to which we're privy and concentrate instead on the hidden parts of our respiratory tracts. The European construction of spirit is grounded on this neglect of the breathing surface of the body and of plant respiration. As Emmanuel Levinas once said, spirit is, in his words, the longest breath there is, which means that what drives it is the desire to dominate the element of air, to incorporate as much of it as possible in the sublime and disincarnate lung of subjectivity, and to interrupt the sharing of breath with the outside world by indefinitely delaying the instant of exhalation. Is this pathetic model applicable to spirit in general? Or is it specific to the Western mutation of spirit, presumably separated from and oblivious to the needs of the body, which lives with, from, and through plants? During one of my visits to India in summer 2009, a yoga teacher from the town of Kottayam in the southwestern region of Kerala insisted on the importance of practicing very slow breathing. He compared the lifespans and breathing paces in a tortoise and a dog, and then went on to link human well-being and longevity to a cultivation of breath. Was this advice parallel to the spiritual suspension of breathing in the West? A far cry from the longest breath there is, the meditative practice of the teacher from Kottayam did not intend to appropriate the biggest share of elemental exteriority, to detain air within ourselves. On the contrary, he emphasized the need to let the breath pass through us better, with more awareness and attention. Similar to plants, we must become the conduits for air, channeling it through ourselves rather than relating to it as a resource. I took the yoga teacher's suggestion not as a panacea to everything that is wrong with the West, but as a different starting point, as another beginning for the cultivation of breath that is more attuned to the vegetal world. The process of breathing, scientifically understood as an exchange of gases between an organism and the atmosphere, is impossible precisely without a true sharing between the inside and the outside. Modern humanity has unlearned the rules of such sharing and has appropriated much more than it has given back, not to mention that what it has dispensed to the surrounding world is little more than pollution and the deadly byproducts of its energy production. It has taken its own breath away, gasping with wonder at the sight of its technological achievements and suffocating under the fumes that emanate from them. More unfortunately still, it is robbing and blocking the breath of non-human forms of life, whose breath is sacrificed on the high altar of spirit. Restoring a more equitable exchange with the environment is the goal of most ecological programs and of proposals for sustainable development. But sharing is not reducible to exchange. We, together with everything that lives, always receive much more from plants than we give back to them, because the plants breathe for all animal and human beings without exception. Although this would be an improvement over the current situation, the sharing of breath is not a matter of instituting a more just natural economy. It is rather the issue of acknowledging the unpayable debt we owe to plants, of partaking of the generosity in which they excel, and of drawing inspiration from this generosity with every breath we take. If the breathing process is elevated to the level of a mindful practice, then nature is cultivated both within us and outside us instead of being enucleated and destroyed. Such cultivation is an alternative origin of culture that does not break its bond to the environment and does not aim to dominate the vegetal world. It recognizes that all terrestrial living beings breathe within the same atmosphere to which they belong, in which they are rooted, and which they have to share in order to subsist. What differs is how each one receives this gift, and what each one can do in order to support this fragile world. This brings me to the sense of sharing, which we must carefully distinguish from dividing. The difference between the two is that sharing life and breath augments and enhances the sphere of the living, whereas dividing life into the so-called natural or human resources diminishes it. Life is what happens between two or more, in contrast to the division that leaves no space in between the living. Division is therefore inherently suffocating, because breathing can only happen in the interstices, when a minimum of breathing space is guaranteed. Our task is to develop a culture through which we would come to view the plants, ourselves, and the air between us as the participants in the ensemble of life, rather than a mesh of quantifiable objects or productive potentialities. That is to say, a culture not allergic to life, but flourishing with it. The cultivation of sharing, rather than division, is perhaps the sole practical and theoretical trend that can still make a positive difference in the disastrous environmental situation we find ourselves in. And where is sharing to commence, if not in the rudimentary activity of our living bodies that necessarily breathe together with and also through others, notably with and through plants? When for weeks, if not months, I suffer from pollen allergies, I am unable to practice my breathing because every breath is a struggle. The same is true for our autistic, allergic culture that shuns life. Having undermined existence so much that everything meaningful pales in comparison with the goal of mere survival, it has deprived us not only of the space but also of the time for deliberate, mindful practice, whether breathing or any other. Within the mix of industrial pollution and spiritual suffocation, how to find the time and the space for breathing, and hence living otherwise. On the other hand, the obvious fact that plants still regenerate every spring is highly significant. The hint for a solution resides there, in the contradiction between cultural suffocation and the natural respiration of plants. We can perhaps begin to change our breathing patterns in the green spaces where division and appropriation do not play an important role, unlike sharing. After my seasonal allergies are over, at the dawn of another season, I can return to the woods and finally open my lungs to the freshness of vegetal respiration. In being with plants, everything slows down to the pace of their growth, and it is in this slowdown, echoing the suggestion of the teacher from Kottayam, that another cultivation of life becomes possible. Part 2. Feeling. Unjustly considered insensitive by philosophers and public opinion alike, plants by far exceed animals and human beings in their attentiveness to what is going on around them at the level of light, heat, moisture, movement, vibration. They are constantly in touch with the elements. Scientists have been for a long time familiar with the sensitivity of vegetal life, though in most cases they have proceeded to utilize it for purposes that are extraneous to the plants themselves. For instance, just to give you an example, a tree can detect an impending earthquake days in advance because of its roots' attunement to the minute vibrations of the subsoil. Human-made implements are capable of translating such vegetal detection into warning signals that are meaningful to us. Is this how we should pay attention to the attention of the plant? Must we convert its sensitivity to the outside into a set of data in order to help us live or survive better? Here, by evacuating a potential earthquake area in advance. If the horizon of possibilities were reduced to this option, wouldn't we treat plants as highly potent instruments, measuring devices, or antennae, a word which is constantly and consistently used in scientific literature, and thus lose sight of everything that is living in them? Humans tend to pay attention to nature when the elements do not cooperate with us, upsetting our plans. As soon as something goes wrong, bad weather strikes, the earth literally gives way underneath our feet, or the sky falls on us, we direct our gazes up or down as the case may be, and, traumatized, recall our inclusion in the fold of the earth, our dwelling place. The Great North American Ice Storm of 1998, which struck Ottawa in my first year there, made residents realize to what extent their lives, the infrastructure of their cities, and especially the power grid, are still integrated with the elemental forces and the world of plants. The storm left between 6 and 10 centimeters of ice accumulated on tree branches and power lines, toppling trees and causing weeks of disruptions and electricity outages amidst freezing temperatures. For those of us who went through that ordeal, it was impossible to ignore either the elements or the limits they imposed on the human mastery of nature. All this would seem to suggest that Heidegger was right, and we're shaken back to life only upon looking death in the face. But another kind of attention, one that is not oriented to death, is also possible, and moreover necessary for our lives and for those of plants. Being under a direct sway of the elements, unprotected by the entire apparatus of civilization with which we shield ourselves from our environment, is perhaps more than we can bear. What is particularly difficult to come to terms with is the real or perceived indifference of the elements to individual existence. We are dwarfed, if not crushed, swallowed up, or dissolved in their sublime milieu. To avoid the feeling of inferiority, we have separated ourselves from them by artificially constructing a world where we can feel at home, secure, safe, comfortable. Now, the walls of this world are so high that we have ceased noticing the elements and considering how they constitute and support our existence. We can either wait for these walls to collapse in the aftermath of a catastrophe, brought about by the current culture of death, or we can scale them and build a different dwelling on the other side, more open to the environment, more attuned to the vegetal world. Just as during the hottest summer months we seek protection from relentless sunshine in the cool shade of a tree, so we can turn to plants for an intervention in our relation to the elements. It is through vegetal life, both within and outside us, that we can cultivate a non-traumatic mode of paying attention to the elemental. I have always preferred sunshine sifted through a lush crown of a tree to the intense light that strikes the eye on a seashore, where brightness is magnified by the white of sand and the reflections of the rays on the surface of the sea. In the woods, the glow of the sun is softer, subtler, more playful, with intricate mosaics of light and shadow. Plants maximize their exposures to sunlight, which they welcome with their leaves. They attend to the sun with every part of their bodies, proliferating in the direction of the celestial blaze. Humans can also bathe in light, and not only of the physical variety, but we do not extend unconditional vegetal hospitality to this element. Nor do we attend to water, the earth, or the sky as plants do. Our attention span is shorter, receptive capacity weaker, attachment to whatever or whoever we attend to less faithful. Seeking refuge, we flee from the elements, while plants expose themselves to the air, the earth, and moisture. It is perhaps this exposure that marked the human condition in the Garden of Eden, where life was more distinctly vegetal. After the fall, Adam and Eve used tree leaves, the most exposed parts of plants, to hide their own nakedness and exposure. With that gesture, they interjected the first screen between themselves and the world, between the two of them, and between each and her or his own self. They lost the paradisiac ability to attend to oneself and to the others in absolute openness. That is to say, they interrupted the flows of energy between the psychic and physical interiority on the one hand, and exteriority on the other. As a result, their attentive comportment suffered irreparable changes, and their distance from the elements grew. When I linger with plants in thoughtful and physical proximity, I try to pay attention to their singular mode of attention. I notice first that plants do not attend to an object or a group of objects. Rather, their attention is inseparable from their life and growth. From a magnificent sequoia to a blade of grass, a plant attends to the physical elements precisely because the elements are not objects and cannot be objectified. Only then, in such non-objectification, are the elements and life itself respected in their proper being. Therefore, human attention, convoked and directed toward life, must strive to be similarly non-objectifying. Second, I appreciate the vegetal way of attending to the elements by contiguity. Plants are together with what they attend to, and their being is being together with air, moisture, the soil, the warmth and the light of the sun. In their attention to the elements, they become themselves. From the apparent elemental indifference, they draw their difference and uniqueness. When I linger with plants, I thus find myself in a communion with everything they are and live with, and I am together with myself differently as well. I become myself otherwise. Third, it seems to me that in the moments of silent meditation in the woods, that plants pay attention to the elements continuously. Their alertness is not awakened solely when their lives are endangered, as ours is when we cross a busy road, which means that it is not summoned by death. Life processes, such as breathing, do not stop while a being is alive, and neither does attention beholden to life. Our embodied existence and the vitality of plants are incessantly attentive to the basic conditions for living, notably those contained in the elements. If we wish to discover vegetal mindfulness in ourselves, we should look no further than our body's unconscious attention to the surroundings. Like the leaves of plants, our skin senses humidity and temperature, light gradients and vibrations. Without knowing it, at least consciously, we pay attention to the world on the surface, from the porous, essentially open, cutinous membrane that keeps our living bodies intact and, at the same time, communicates with whatever lies beyond them. Like leaves, we breathe on the surface of our skin, not only through the lungs, as I have already mentioned. Every one of these innumerable tiny breaths is a channel between the body and the elemental milieu wherein it is immersed. Seemingly effortless, the breathing of the skin and of the leaf, their minute attention to air, is nourished by the energy of life itself. We cannot and should not control this process, but we can shuttle between the breathing of the skin and of the lungs, between our unconscious and conscious attention to the world, and between vegetal and human mindfulness within and outside us. The plant's rootedness in the soil determines their attentiveness to the places that they inhabit, the places they cannot leave behind or negate in the manner of animals or humans. Being with plants, we learn to consider the fine grains of a place, which is much more than an isolated point on the system of spatial coordinates or a site through which we momentarily pass. Living attention to the location of growth is inscribed in the spatial pattern of vegetal bodies. More branches on the sunnier side of the tree, less roots if a plant grows in close proximity to another of the same species, and so forth. By the very way plants inhabit their environments, they direct us toward the elements to which they attend. For me, this idea will remain forever associated to a singular place, the wooded setting of the McMichael Canadian Art Collection in Kleinburg, Ontario, housing the works of the Group of Seven and the Canadian First Nations. The northern pines of the Courtright Center for Conservation, where the gallery is located, much like the trees depicted in the paintings of Fred Varley or Franklin Carmichael, express an evocative interplay of vegetal and artistic attentions to places and to the elements. Over several years, I spent almost every weekend at McMichael in the vicinity, alternating between the works of art and the woods that encircled the gallery building. Each visit changed not only my experience of that place, but also of time. After a while, I could no longer tell if I spent 20 minutes or 2 hours with plants. My sense was that everything happened more slowly, and that in that deceleration, which facilitated a closer attention to plants and to the elements, living became more vibrant. Time and again, time was gained for life. Thank you.